All right, guys, last section that we're going to have for this chapter here. We're talking about Imperial China collapsing, which is section 3 of chapter 30. We got to kind of set the stage in the fact that in the early 1900s, China is really ready for a revolution. They'd faced years of humiliation throughout their history from outsiders, foreign country who come in and control the trade and economic resources. And the Chinese themselves are actually starting to believe that modernization and nationalism is the country's key to survival. And for the longest time, if we recall going back, that China was really at the forefront of a lot of technological issues. But now they've kind of fallen behind with the Western world. A huge part of that is they don't have an army and a navy that is going to be able to stand up to anybody. They need to construct factories that are much better and also reform education. But they believed that China's greatness, others did, that it laid in the traditional ways that they had. So there's really kind of an issue that's taking place. And a group that's known as the nationalists kind of go through, and they are going to be the ones who are going to kind of revolutionize the Chinese themselves. Among those groups that are pushing for modernization and nationalism was a group known as the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party. And their first really good leader was a man named Sun Yat-sen. And in 1911, the Revolutionary Alliance, which was the forerunner for the Kuomintang, succeeded in overthrowing the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. And the Qing had ruled China since 1644. So we're talking about a time period that really is going to span for a long, long time. It's kind of a shaky start in the beginning, but Sun Yat-sen becomes president of the new Republic of China, and he hopes to establish a government that is based on 3 principles. That's nationalism, or essentially an end to foreign control in this country, people's rights, which was democracy, and lastly, people's livelihood, which was economic security for all the Chinese. And Sun is going to consider nationalism vital. He turns over the presidency after a while that he's in power to a very powerful young general named Yuan Shikai, who becomes sort of an issue for them because he betrays the democratic ideals of the revolutions. And his actions actually are going to spark a civil war. And real authority is going to fall out of the hands of that nationalist group and fall into the hands of warlords or very powerful military leaders. And they rule territories such as that are very large and that their armies can actually go through and conquer. World War I is going to spell quite a few problems for China. In 1917, the government in Beijing is hoping for an Allied victory. And the reason is because Germany holds a lot of land that was in China. So China actually declares war against Germany. And they believe that the participation for that the Allies would return control of the Chinese territories that had belonged to Germany over the time. But under the Treaty of Versailles that we've talked about, Allied leaders actually gives those territories to Japan. So the Treaty of Versailles and declaring war actually turns against them. When the news of that treaty actually reaches over China, there's outrage all throughout the country. And on May 4th of 1919, you have 3,000 angry students who gather in the center of Beijing. And the movement actually spreads to other cities and expands into a national movement that was called the May 4th movement. You have workers, shopkeepers, all types of professionals joining that cause. And it's not officially a revolution, but those demonstrations do kind of show the commitment of the Chinese people to establish a strong modern nation. Sun Yat-sen and members of the Kuomintang also share the aims of the movement, but they can't strengthen the central rule on their own. And so many young Chinese intellectuals actually turn against Yat-sen's beliefs in Western democracy in favor of Lenin's kind of brand of Soviet communism. The Communist Party comes out of a group that meets in Shanghai to organize this group known as the Chinese Communist Party. And among them is a young man named Mao Zedong. He is essentially a librarian at Beijing University, and he's among the founders. And he becomes China's greatest revolutionary leader. He begins developing his own brand of communism. When we look at communism itself, Lenin bases his Marxist revolution on organization in Russia's cities. Mao goes a little bit differently. He looks to the rural countryside as a part of that, where peasants would be the true revolutionaries. And he is going to push on the peasantry to become a much more powerful group. And the Chinese Communist Party is forming. You have Sun Yat-sen and the Nationalist Party setting up government in South China. And like the communists, Sun kind of becomes delusioned with the Western democracies that kind of refuse to support his struggling government. So what ends up happening is Sun decides that he's going to ally the Kuomintang with the newly formed Communist Party. And he hopes to unite all the revolutionary groups together for common action, so at least something can be achieved in China. And when Sun kind of puts his Kuomintang with the Communist Party, Lenin sees this as a huge opportunity to help Chinese nationalist government. And so in 1923, Lenin is going to send his military advisors and a bunch of equipment to the nationalists in return for allowing the Chinese communists to join the Kuomintang. Once all of this and the peasants align with the communists, Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, and he is succeeded by a man named Zhang Jieshi. He's head of the Kuomintang now, and he's the son of a middle-class merchant. And a lot of his followers that he has behind him are bankers, business people, those types of groups who don't necessarily like the idea of communism. They fear that communists' goal of creating a socialist economy models very much after the Soviet Union. And Zhang had promised democracy and political rights to all Chinese, which we've learned about sometimes especially in the Soviet Union, doesn't always match up with with the communist and democratic sides. His government becomes steadily less democratic, however, and more corrupt. And most peasants that are in China believe that Zhang was doing very little to actually improve their lives. And because of that, they throw their support behind the Chinese Communist Party. And in order to enlist those support of the peasants, Mao divides the land that the communists won among the local farmers themselves. And so you're going to see a clash that is going to take place. At first, Zhang is going to put aside his differences with the communists. But together, his forces and the communists successfully fight off all the warlords that had taken power after Sun's armies couldn't defeat them. But after they take over from the warlords, he turns against the communists. And in April 1927, the nationalist troops and armed gangs move into Shanghai. And there they kill a bunch of communist leaders and trade union members in the city streets. You have killings that take place in other cities as well, but those being the most famous. And the nationalists nearly wipe out the entire Chinese Communist Party. And in 1928, Jiang becomes the president of what's known as the National Republic of China. This is important to understand because essentially later on we're going to have two types of government in China. The one that is the National Republic of China, that is backed by both Great Britain and the United States. They formally recognize that. But the Soviet Union does not. The communists, after this communist slaughter at Shanghai, the Soviet Union does not agree with that. And so we have a side in which takes place in which we have kind of a democratic more side under Zhang and a communist side that is going to be under Mao. And the communists have this rage over the massacre that exists, and that is going to lead into a civil war that's going to last up until 1949. By 1930, there's nationalists and communists are fighting a very, very bloody civil war is taking place. And Mao and other communist leaders are going to establish themselves in the hills of what is south central China. And we'll see this on the map that you see next. Mao's going to refer to his tactic of taking his revolution to the countryside. And he recruits peasants to join what he calls his Red Army. He trains them in the art of guerrilla warfare, which, as we kind of know, we've talked about a little bit, is essentially this fighting behind enemy lines. It's fighting and then retreating back away from things. The nationalists attack the communists repeatedly, but they actually fail to drive them out of any successful area. So the Long March, guys, in 1933, Zhang is going to gather an army of at least 700,000 men. And Zhang's army kind of surrounds the communist mountain stronghold that we can see on that map that is at the bottom in red. The communist forces are badly outnumbered. We're talking about somewhere around 700,000 troops to essentially about 100,000 communist forces. And there is no way that they can actually fight this group of people. So what do? They decide to go on. Now, they didn't know it was going to be this long at the time, but a 6,000-mile long journey that's called the Long March. And it takes place between 1934 and 1935, in which the communist forces are going to be able to keep just a step ahead of Zhang's forces. And you're going to have quite a few who die from hunger, all kinds of issues that are taking place there. And they leave the caves of South China to the caves of Shanxi that's in the north, located at that map at the top portion of that. You can see where that is right up near Inner Mongolia. Essentially, it's the distance from New York to San Francisco and then back again. They're crossing swampland, sleeping in the mud, leaning back to back in pairs. You have them crossing 18 different mountain ranges, 24 rivers in that year-long flight that they're taking from them. Finally, after a little more than a year, Mao and 7,000 or 8,000 communist survivors settle in the caves in northwestern China in Shanxi. And there they're going to gain a bunch of new followers. And when this happens, when the Civil War is taking place, what ends up happening is Japan invades China. And that's going to kind of put a halt on the Civil War itself. And so when the Civil War is suspended in 1931, the Chinese fought Chinese, essentially. The Japanese see those power struggles, and they have a rising interest. The Japanese forces took advantage of the weakening situation that was taking place with the Chinese communists fighting the Chinese nationalists, and they invade Manchuria, which was an industrial province in the northeast part of China. And that is a huge part of what is going to take place here. 1937, they launched their all-out invasion. Massive bombings of villages and cities, killing thousands of Chinese. And you have destruction of farms that was necessary for the Chinese to survive. A lot of people dying of starvation. And by 1938, Japan had a control of a large part of China. That threat by the Japanese forces a very uneasy truce between Zhang and Mao's forces. And the Civil War is going to gradually come to a halt as the nationalists and communists temporarily unite to fight the Japanese. The National Assembly that's in charge further agrees to promote changes outlined in Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. And that is going to cause that uneasy truth. But in reality, guys, when we look at what happened against them, Mao's forces are going to do a lot more fighting than Zhang's forces. And so it kind of keeps Zhang's forces fresh. The Civil War will suspend for quite some time. We're looking at even pushing this into World War II, because what ends up taking place is after Japan invades, that's when Hitler comes to power in Germany. And when that takes place, we have an issue that causes those people to kind of rest and take it back. So the next kind of thing we'll talk about is Hitler coming to power and rising to power in our next chapter. But just understand this civil war that's taking place between the Chinese and the Chinese, the communists and the nationalists, will resume once World War II is over. That'll be it for this chapter, guys. You guys have your study guide ready to go, so we'll have that. Have you guys take a look at that